Okay, thanks everyone for coming in person and online. Tonight we have Julia Nakamura, who is a second-year graduate student in psychology and also a member of our community, which makes sense because this is the members series. It'd be odd if she wasn't. So as usual, you can join us online, and Julia will put up the link to the Slido, and I'll monitor the chat and let us know if there's any issues with the sound. And yeah, we'll pass the microphone around for questions. Please don't forget to grab the microphone from me or whoever your neighbor who has the microphone is before you ask the question. Okay, take it away, Julia.
Thanks, Steve. Hi, everyone. I'm Julia, as most of you know. I'm a second-year graduate student in psychology, and my research is at the intersection of health psychology, epidemiology, and biostatistics, and gerontology, which is the study of aging. Today I'm going to be presenting on informal helping as sort of an undervalued form of prosocial engagement. But first, I'm going to put up this slide. You can go to this website, ask a question, type in the code, and now we'll begin. So this is just a brief roadmap of my talk today. I'm going to start with an introduction on prosocial behaviors in older adults. Then I'll talk about informal helping, 2 studies that we're working on in our lab, and then some future directions. So I want to start with this photo of my grandpa's neighbors, Pat and Walt. And my grandpa suffered from a fall a few years ago, and this was while he was sort of taking out his trash cans. And Pat and Walt sort of stepped up and offered to take out his trash cans for him, and they did this for a time while he was recovering. And I think we can all think about people in our lives who have done these sort of small acts that really make a difference. And I'll circle back to Pat and Walt later in the talk, but I'll start by saying that they're part of our rapidly growing population of older adults. So over the next 20 years, the number of adults aged greater than 65 is expected to increase by 68% in Canada and nearly 50% in the US. And with this demographic shift, unfortunately, comes an increase in the burden of chronic disease. So we know that older adults in Canada account for almost 46% of the public sector healthcare budget, and Medicare beneficiaries in the US cost around $873 billion annually. And so investigators are increasingly looking to modifiable health assets that might increase the health and well-being of our rapidly aging populations. And one health asset that is of increasing interest to researchers is prosocial behaviors. So what are prosocial behaviors? These are a constellation of voluntary acts that are motivated by a concern for the welfare or benefit of others. And these behaviors aren't only highly common, but they're also really vital in society. Things like altruism and cooperation and trust are really necessary for society to function well. And we know that prosocial behaviors are important to look at because they benefit society as well as the individuals engaging in these behaviors. And they're particularly interesting to study in older adults. And so we know that the majority of our growing population of older adults expresses a desire to stay active and productive in retirement. And so one key reason to look at these prosocial behaviors in older adults is that this generation has a really unique set of knowledge and skills and experiences that no other generation has. And so experts in our field have described our aging population as sort of an untapped natural resource. And while I recognize that's a bit of an odd term to use, the sentiment of this is that this population has both the desire and the potential to give back in really meaningful ways. And so when we look at prosocial behaviors in older adults, we typically focus on volunteering. And volunteering is defined as an activity undertaken by an individual that is uncoerced, unpaid, structured by an organization, and directed towards a community concern. And we see that volunteering is, in fact, associated with improved health and well-being outcomes for people doing the volunteering. So in this study, we compared the health outcomes of people who volunteered 100 hours or more per year as compared to people who didn't volunteer at all. And this threshold of 100 hours has been seen in the literature as sort of an inflection point for health benefits. And while this might seem like a lot, 100 hours per year only corresponds to about 2 hours per week. And so this is fairly reasonable for most people. So we see that volunteering at this threshold of 100 hours per year is associated with better physical health, such as improved cognition, better health behaviors like more frequent physical activity, improved psychosocial outcomes, so things like higher purpose in life and lower depression. And probably most notably, volunteering has been associated with a reduced risk of mortality. And this is accounting for an extensive number of confounding factors that might otherwise explain this association. But we're not the only ones who have found this. So in this recent review, Burr and colleagues said, it's no longer a question of whether volunteering is predictive of reduced mortality risk. Rather, our results suggest that the volunteering to mortality association is reliable and that the magnitude of this relationship is sizable. So while there's this large and growing body of evidence around the health and well-being benefits of formal volunteering, less is known about the downstream benefits of one of the most common types of prosocial behaviors, which is informal helping. So throughout this talk, I might use the term informal volunteering, but these are synonymous. So what is informal helping? Informal helping is unpaid volunteering that's not coordinated by an organization or institution, directed towards helping people outside of one's household. So this is things like babysitting, cooking meals, providing transportation, maybe taking out trash cans, as I mentioned with Pat and Walt earlier, and so on. And so to give an example, as all of you sitting here know, at Green College we have this communication platform called Green Chat, which is just a way that we can all sort of mass email and communicate with each other. And this email is from a resident at Green who gave me their permission to share this, but asked to remain anonymous. And so this email was in reference to the fact that we were sort of switching from a pickup meal plan to one where you could attend in person, but not everyone was comfortable doing that. And so this resident just offered to send out, he sent out an email saying, if you don't want to get breakfast for any reason, let me know, I'll pick it up and drop it off. And so this is just a great example of one of these sort of informal helping behaviors. So informal helping is one of the most common types of helping behaviors, but it's one of the least studied. And so we're going to think about it sort of compared to formal volunteering and see why this is an important behavior to study. So, first reason is that informal helping might be more accessible. So we know that for maybe people in lower socioeconomic situations, maybe who are working really labor-intensive jobs or multiple jobs, it actually might be difficult to find the time and energy to formally volunteer. Or maybe for older adults who are constrained by physical limitations, maybe an older person in a wheelchair, they might not be able to sort of act on their prosocial desires through formal volunteering. And so informal helping might be a more accessible outlet. The second is that informal helping is more common than formal volunteering. And this is true in both wealthy and poor countries around the world. But to use Canada as an example, this graph is showing the percentage of baby boomers, and that's people born between 1946 and 1965, so just generally older adults, showing the percentage of baby boomers who participated in each type of volunteering in 2018. So on the left, we can see that informal helping is occurring around, among around 73% of baby boomers. On the right, we see that formal volunteering is occurring around among about 39% of baby boomers. So the rate of informal helping is almost twice as high as that of formal volunteering. And this graph is similar. Here we're looking at just the number of hours, and we see that again, the number of hours of informal helping is almost twice that of formal volunteering. So if informal helping is both accessible to more people, and particularly to older adults, and also more common, then it's important that we understand sort of the downstream health and well-being benefits of informal helping. But this recent book chapter by Einoff and colleagues suggests that little is known about the individual and social benefits of informal volunteering, and the state of knowledge is not yet complete enough to inform policy. And so they make the argument that current discussions of civic engagement might be too narrow, and they might be excluding these really important informal contributions that are being made. And so that brings us to our first study, where we asked the question, is increased informal helping engagement associated with improved health and well-being for the person doing the helping? And there's been some prior research on this topic, and in that prior literature, informal helping has been associated with better physical health, better psychological well-being, and lower psychological distress. But overall, very few studies have been done, and there are some limitations in this prior work. The first is that many of these studies are cross-sectional, and this really limits our understanding of directionality. So is it that informal helping is lowering someone's depression, or is it that people who have lower depression are more likely to engage in informal helping? The second is that many of these studies don't have adequate control for potential confounders, and so there are many potential third variable issues. And the last, as I said, is that the prior literature has looked at a very limited number of health outcomes. So improving upon this question of, is increased informal helping associated with improved health and well-being, we asked, are changes in informal helping approved with subsequent health and well-being after a 4-year follow-up period? So it's important to ask about changes in informal helping because this is more similar to what we might see from an intervention. So if we were to increase someone's informal helping, what health and well-being outcomes might we see follow? And this at the bottom here is just a little model that I'm going to sort of build throughout this talk. Okay, so we use data from the Health and Retirement Study, which is a longitudinal panel study of older adults over the age of 50 in the United States. And so older adults do sort of a face-to-face interview, and after that interview, they're left with sort of a leave-behind questionnaire, so a questionnaire that asks about some of these psychosocial variables that they mail in after their interview. And after excluding people who didn't report psychosocial data in this baseline wave, our sample was about 13,000. And so I'm just going to briefly characterize this sample. The average age was about 65. Over half of participants were female. Participants were primarily white, married, and high school educated. Nearly half were employed, and around 57% reported engaging in informal helping. Okay, so I'm going to briefly go over this outcome-wide analytic approach that we use in our lab. This was developed by our colleague Tyler Vanderweel and his colleagues at Harvard. So here we have 3 waves, the pre-baseline, baseline, and outcome waves. Each of these are spaced 4 years apart in our study. We look at informal helping at baseline, and this is split up into categories of 0, 1 to 49, 50 to 99, or 100 plus hours per year. And we see how, just kidding. And we asked the participants the question, have you spent any time in the past 12 months helping friends, neighbors, or relatives who did not live with you and did not pay you for the help? And then we see how informal helping is associated with 35 health and well-being outcomes. And here these fall under the categories of health behaviors, physical health, psychological well-being and distress, and social factors. So I've put these 35 outcomes up on the next slide. And the outcomes in this list that I'm showing you have been identified as the antecedents, processes, and consequences of successful aging in key gerontological models. So I'm not going to read all of these, but I'll go through a few examples. So this includes physical health outcomes, things like mortality and chronic conditions. Health behaviors, things like frequent physical activity, smoking, drinking, and sleep problems. Psychological well-being outcomes like purpose in life, psychological distress, things like depression, and social factors like loneliness. We also adjust for a wide variety of covariates in the pre-baseline wave. So we adjust for sociodemographic variables, things like age, race, socioeconomic status. We also adjust for informal helping, which allows us to look at changes in informal helping between the pre-baseline and baseline waves. And then finally, we adjust for all of our outcomes, so all 35 of those outcomes, which helps us mitigate some of our concerns of reverse causation. And then we also use Bonferroni correction to account for multiple testing. So all these tests we're running, we take our p-value of 0.05 and divide it by our total number of outcomes. Okay, so getting into our results, just to orient us, here we're comparing the group who engaged in the most informal helping, so 100 hours per year or more, compared to those who did not engage in informal helping at all. And in the reference column, you'll see values of 1 or 0. A reference group of 1 means we're looking at a binary outcome, and so this estimate can be interpreted as a risk or odds ratio, and a reference group of 0 means we're looking at a continuous outcome. So, informal helping at 100 hours a year per more, as compared to those 100 hours per year or more. That is such a mouthful. I have a hard time saying it every time. As compared to those who didn't engage in any informal helping, had a 32% decreased risk of mortality, a 22% decreased risk of stroke, 21% reduced risk of physical functioning limitations, an 18% reduced risk of cognitive impairment, and higher self-rated health. I'm also not going to walk through the null results here. I'm just going to highlight where we saw associations, but these are really important to think about as well. Next, when looking at health behaviors, we see that people who engaged in 100 hours per year or more of informal helping had an 11% increased likelihood of engaging in frequent physical activity. When looking at our psychological outcomes, informal helping was associated with higher positive affect, so positive emotions, higher optimism and purpose in life, and higher mastery and health mastery. We also saw that informal helping was also associated with higher negative affect, so that's sort of more negative emotions, which is a finding that I'll return to in a minute. And lastly, when looking at social factors, people who engaged in 100 hours per year or more of informal helping had a 13% decreased likelihood of infrequent contact with children, and a 17% decreased likelihood of infrequent contact with friends. So another way to say that is that people who engaged in informal helping were in more frequent contact with their children and also their friends. So I've put a summary of these findings here all on one slide, just to have them all in one place. And in some supplementary analyses, we were interested in seeing how adjusting for formal volunteering and caregiving might influence these associations. So we're interested in seeing if these associations stand out above and beyond formal volunteering and caregiving. And so we also were hoping this would help us tease apart why informal helping was associated with more negative affect or negative emotions. And so our associations between informal helping and physical health outcomes and health behaviors didn't really change much, but volunteering and caregiving appear to account for some of the associations with psychological and social factors. So you'll see that I've highlighted where we no longer see associations, and that association with negative affect is gone. So it's possible that something like caregiving, which can be quite stressful, was accounting for the association between informal helping and increased negative affect. Okay, so if we know that informal helping is associated with some improved health and well-being outcomes in older adults, the next question we were interested in asking is, are there factors that increase informal helping? So it's useful to know, sort of from an intervention standpoint, what modifiable factors might be associated with increased informal helping. And again, in this review by Einoff and colleagues, they said there's been so little research on initiatives to encourage informal volunteering that it's not yet possible to make recommendations as to whether governments or nonprofits should encourage it or how they could most effectively do so. And so in the prior literature, again, we see a variety of factors that might be associated with increased informal helping. This includes things like physical activity and other health behaviors, physical health factors, psychological factors, and social factors. And again, this literature is pretty small, and we notice some limitations. The first is, again, that many studies use cross-sectional designs, which is still problematic for discerning directionality. Again, we have a lot of inadequate control for potential confounders, and many few predictors have been assessed overall. We also noticed that a lot of the prior literature looks at non-modifiable predictors of informal helping, so things like age and race. And while these are really important to study, they're less useful from an intervention standpoint because we can't intervene on those factors. Lastly, many studies look at predictors accumulated over the life course rather than looking at changes in predictors like we might expect to see from someone who intervened on these predictors. So improving upon this original question of what factors might predict increased informal helping, we asked if changes were made to our predictors, which I'll show in a minute, what changes to informal helping might we expect to see 4 years later? And so again, building on this model, now we're looking at antecedents or predictors of subsequent informal helping. And this is again from data from the health and retirement study, so I'm not going to spend too much time characterizing the sample, but this is sort of the same pool of participants as the prior study. Okay, so now we're looking at a variation of the outcome-wide approach that I shared earlier, and this is the predictor-wide analytic approach. And so here again we have 3 waves, each spaced 4 years apart. We're now looking at about 61 predictors, again, that fall under these same categories, and how these are associated with subsequent informal helping. And there's many different ways to operationalize this outcome. Here we did it as a yes/no, so I engaged in informal helping or I did not. But we can look at it with the 100-hour threshold and in a variety of other ways. The results are usually quite similar because we've done this in a couple ways. With a few exceptions, most of the predictors predict no matter what our sort of outcome looks like. And again, in the pre-baseline wave, we're adjusting for socio-demographic variables, informal helping to mitigate concerns of reverse causation, and then all of our predictors, which is what allows us to look at changes in those predictors. So I've put these predictors up on the next 2 slides, and I had to spread them out on 2 slides because they didn't fit onto one, but I thought it would be fun, I don't know, we'll see, to maybe take a second, look over these predictors, and think about what factors you think might be associated with someone's informal helping. So factors that might increase the likelihood of them engaging in informal helping, or factors that might inhibit them from doing so. So here we have physical health conditions, health behaviors, and psychological well-being factors. And then on the second part, or the second half of the list, we have psychological distress factors and social factors. So maybe take a second, glance over the list. This has been done on Zoom, and people normally type in the chat what they think might predict. Does anyone want to shout out a factor or 2 that they think might be predictive of subsequent informal helping? Life satisfaction, great.
Religious service attendance?
Arthritis. Great. Okay. So now you can see if your prediction, whatever mental prediction you made, is correct. Okay. And lastly, again, we use Bonferroni correction to account for multiple testing. Okay, so I'm just going to verbally highlight sort of the strongest associations that we observed, and the rest will be sort of highlighted on the slides. So when looking at physical health factors, we see that people who had a stroke at baseline had a 26% decreased likelihood of engaging in informal helping. People with physical functioning limitations were 25% less likely to engage in informal helping. And in terms of health behaviors, people who engaged in frequent physical activity at baseline had a 33% increased likelihood of engaging in informal helping. So no on arthritis. Sorry, Gabe. Next, when looking at our psychological outcomes, we see that positive affect, purpose in life, mastery, and health mastery were associated with increased informal helping, and depression, depressive symptoms, hopelessness, and constraints were associated with decreased informal helping. Next, when looking at social factors, we see that contact with friends and other family was associated with increased informal helping. Maybe unsurprisingly, people who had very frequent contact with friends, 3 or more times per week, were 46% more likely to engage in informal helping 4 years later. And in part 2 of our social factors, we see that people who volunteered 200 hours per year or more were 30% more likely to engage in informal helping, which again might not be surprising as these prosocial behaviors tend to be sort of associated. Okay, so we might be interested to see if there are common factors that appear to influence prosocial behaviors more broadly. So are there factors that are associated with both increased volunteering and also informal helping? And I'm not going to go through all these results, but we do see that some factors like physical functioning limitations and cognitive impairment decrease the risk of engaging in both formal volunteering and informal helping, while others like depression are only associated with one. So depression was only associated with a decreased risk of informal helping, and it might be interesting to think about sort of why that is. So maybe someone who's depressed is more likely to sort of stop their informal helping engagements, but is more likely to continue sort of a formal volunteering engagement. And again, don't have time to go through all those results, but that's kind of what we're hoping to think about in the future. Okay, so lastly, I'm going to talk about some sort of future directions. I'll start by just commenting on some strengths and limitations of these studies. Starting with some limitations, these are observational studies, and so we always have issues with self-report bias, potentially for physical conditions and health behaviors. We always have the potential for unmeasured confounding, no matter how robustly we try to adjust for covariates. And these studies were done in US samples, and so these results might not generalize to broader samples. In terms of strengths, we do use longitudinal study design, so this is helpful for teasing apart some of that directionality. We do have very robust covariate control, and these outcome and exposure-wide approaches represent an efficiency gain for researchers and editors and reviewers, because we can evaluate effect sizes across exposures and outcomes. And we can also publish a lot of null findings, which is good as well. And these outcome and predictor-wide approaches are really data-driven approaches. They're meant to be hypothesis-generating and aimed at discovering promising predictors and outcomes, which then will need to undergo further investigation in future studies. And so they're helpful for determining what health outcomes we might expect to see, and also what promising predictors might be. Okay, in terms of future directions, there are many in mind, so I'll go over a few. The first is that we're interested in doing some moderator and mediator-wide studies on informal helping. And so what are those? These studies would help us get a better understanding of the moderators. So these are factors that might influence the links between informal helping and health, things like age, race, gender, sex, and socioeconomic status. And then we're also interested in looking at mediators. So what are the mechanisms? Like, how is it that informal helping is associated with better health and well-being outcomes? We also recognize the need for other kinds of research. So at later stages, things like randomized controlled trials to supplement sort of these epidemiological longitudinal analyses. And then again, looking at these things in other populations. So we're doing some work with Gallup world poll data, so that helps us assess these questions in worldwide populations. Hopefully soon with the Canadian longitudinal study of aging and in other samples as well. I also want to point out that there's an array of other factors that we can consider here. So this is my sort of model that I've been using to organize myself, but there's so many other things to think about. One of them is culture. We know that these sort of prosocial behaviors operate differently in Eastern and Western cultures, more individualistic versus collectivist societies, and so we definitely need to think about that. There's also some evidence that prosocial behaviors are stress buffering, so things like volunteering and informal helping might help buffer against sort of stressful events. We can also think about motivation, so why are people engaging in these prosocial behaviors? We actually find that people who volunteer for self-oriented reasons, maybe like, I don't know, their resume or career, they don't appear to have the same benefits as people who volunteer for other oriented reasons. So when looking at mortality risk, people who volunteered for self-oriented reasons had a similar mortality risk to people who didn't volunteer at all. And then people who volunteered for other oriented reasons actually saw a reduced mortality risk. And lastly, it's important to look at some different sort of layers and levels of the model. So right now, this is really focused on the micro individual level, but we can also look at volunteering at the meso level, so how volunteering might spread between people and networks. And then also at the macro level, thinking about sort of the larger societal benefits of prosocial behaviors. They contribute to the economy, they're improving health, and there's a wide variety of societal benefits that we might see. Etc. And there's so much more. So the last thing I want to talk about is a bit of knowledge translation. And so here I'm going to zoom out a bit from informal helping and talk more broadly about work that we've done on formal volunteering these past few years. And so, yeah, during this time, I think I've recognized the importance of knowledge translation and the importance of emphasizing work that translates to the real world. So I'm going to talk about a bit about some translational science that we're doing. So what is translational science? This is research aimed at translating results from basic research to results that directly benefit humans. So we in the sort of health sciences talk about translating from the bench or the lab to the bedside where the patient is. And so to give sort of an example, there's some reciprocity here. So in prior work, we looked at predictors of volunteering. And let's say we learned that decreased or physical functioning is associated with, physical functioning limitations are associated with a decreased risk of volunteering. We might take that knowledge to our community partners, which we've done, to think about ways that we can reduce some of the barriers associated with volunteering for people who have physical functioning limitations. And then on the flip side, I've learned a lot from my work with United Way, which I can talk about in a minute, that has helped inform sort of my research questions. So one thing we know is that retaining volunteers is a problem that United Way faces. So in some of our other work, we looked at what predicts sustained volunteering engagement over time. And this is hopefully to help answer that question of how can we better retain volunteers. So one of our community partners is United Way Worldwide, and this is an international volunteering organization. And their mission is to improve lives by mobilizing the caring power of communities around the world to advance the common good through health, education, and financial stability. And so we've done some work with United Way over the past couple of years, which I will get into next. So when the pandemic started, United Way was really interested in how we could serve and engage older adults during COVID. And so I worked with May Cobb, who's the Senior Director of Volunteer Engagement at United Way Worldwide, to learn about initiatives that local United Ways around the world were doing to serve older adults. And so we interviewed 18 local United Ways across the US and Canada, such as Tri-County United Way and United Way of Greater Victoria, which is here in BC. And we asked about the projects that they were doing to serve older adults in their communities, things like how did you get in touch with older adults in your communities, what are the greatest needs of older adults in your areas, to better learn about sort of the work that they were doing. Just to give an example of some of the kinds of work and projects that they were doing, this is from United Way of Hancock County. And here they partnered with school groups who made handmade cards and care packages that were sent to older adults at long-term care facilities, so things like nursing homes. And yeah, there was a variety of handmade donations, cards, artwork, store-bought gifts like puzzles and playing cards that were delivered in these care packages. And we see that this initiative had a pretty large impact in the community. So there were around 33 donor groups that participated, 650 older adults received some kind of care package, 58 requested to be a pen pal with one of the people at the partner schools, and around nearly 600 handmade drawings, pieces of artwork, and notes were created. And so, learning from all of these different projects that were being done, we developed what United Way refers to as volunteer project ideas. And these are sort of how-to manuals for starting volunteer initiatives. And so we synthesized our findings from these interviews with sort of best practices and tips to serve as guidelines for local United Ways. And so here are two that we did, one on care packages, sort of like the example I showed, another on meal delivery. We know that food insecurity was a big problem for older adults during COVID. And then also just, general guidelines we learned about the top needs of older adults. Okay, I'm going to circle back to the slide of Pat and Walt that I showed earlier. I think it's very easy to get caught up in all the numbers and statistics, and so I just wanted to end with this reminder that these are our friends and our family that we're talking about. Many of us have older adults in our lives that we care about and that we want to age with good health, and we know that these older adults have a lot to give back to society as well. And so that these acts of informal helping with Pat and Walt, taking in my grandpa's trash cans for him, really make a big difference in our lives and the lives of people that we care about. And when I asked them to share a photo, they were telling me a story about how when my grandpa was near the end of his life, he brought some lemons. He had a lemon tree in his backyard. And they gave him some chocolate-covered strawberries, which he was just over the moon about, so excited about, apparently. And they said it just takes the simple things, and I really appreciate the sentiment of that. These little acts of informal helping can really make a big difference. And with that, I will acknowledge our lab, collaborators, and funders. And that is everything.
Thanks. We have plenty of time for questions. Does anyone have a question?
Hi, Julia. First, this is a fantastic presentation. Thank you so much. You kind of answered this question partially in your last 5 minutes or so, but near the beginning of your presentation, you mentioned that generally past literature on prosocial behavior was generally uncertain about how governments and nonprofits could encourage these interventions in informal helping. I was wondering what sort of interventions have been tried, if at all, if these attempts at intervention encouragement have influenced your approach to this study, and really without committing to anything, what are you inclined to think might work as a means of encouraging prosocial behaviors from that kind of top-down level, or if such an approach is even possible?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks. So, yeah, I think that in terms of, we don't do interventions on how to increase these behaviors, but there are people who are doing this work, and I think it's quite important. I am aware of only one study that has looked at how to increase informal helping, because these are sort of informal things that people do. And this was just a sort of community level intervention. I think it was done in around 26 countries around the world, some kind of randomized control trial. And they just taught people about contact and cooperation and trust, and saw that they were able to increase people's sort of, I think it was cooperation and trust were the two outcomes they looked at sort of the neighborhood level. And the goal here is that, maybe increasing these feelings of reciprocity and trust with others would then increase the likelihood of engaging in some of these behaviors. With older adults specifically, I would be inclined to think that a lot of the barriers have to do with maybe physical barriers or cognitive barriers, which were some of the predictors we saw. And so I think it would be, great in future work to try to see if we can, make more accessible opportunities for people who do have some of these limitations. And I know that United Way right now is doing some work trying to highlight these informal contributions around the world. And they're working with the High-Level Political Forum, which is part of the United Nations, to try to recognize some of these more informal acts that are happening in countries around the world. So I think it's a growing area, and I don't have answers quite yet, but lots of exciting work being done.
Hi.
Thank you.
Thank you. Your slides are very beautiful.
Thank you.
I had a few questions. My first question was about the first study, and I hope my memory serves me right. But you said one of the health outcomes was that they had an increased physical activity.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering how you assessed whether that was the fact that they were engaging in informal help that was the physical activity, or was it a separate activity? Because I'm guessing that physical activity could have been measured by walking to my my neighbor's house and giving them chocolate-covered strawberries?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we can't tease that apart. Like, our questions are very broad. You know, how much physical activity do you engage in per week? And we don't know exactly what they were doing. But like you said, I would assume that people who are engaging in informal helping are doing things like buying groceries, walking their neighbor's dog. And those things themselves might be actually what's increasing physical activity. It could also be that just engaging in informal helping is improving health generally. People are getting out more, and so they feel more like capable of going on walks and doing things that are more active. So I would like to eventually, tease apart some of these things in more detail and maybe look at, like, is it, what is it about these informal helping activities that is making people more active? And it could be so many things. Like, maybe I engage in informal helping, I become better friends with my neighbors, and then we start like going on walks together, right? And so it's probably a combination, if I had to guess.
Okay, I have two other questions. My second one is, so you did the second study was over a 4 or 8 year period? Mm-hmm. Which one?
So both of these are over 8 years total.
Okay. Yeah.
Let me find, here.
Yeah. So, sorry.
Okay.
How, maybe I missed this, but so if you're an older adult, you, I don't know, you may have dementia over the years, or for example, dementia. How do you take into account, how did you take that into account given the dementia or other health-related issues that could arise due to old age?
Right. Great question. So we typically, we try to adjust for a variety of these health outcomes that you mentioned. And so for all 61 of these different health factors, things like you mentioned, like cognitive impairment, all of these things, we've adjusted for these to sort of account for them in a way. For people with dementia specifically, the Health and Retirement Study, which is the data set that we're using, usually can do kind of proxy interviews if the person isn't able to sort of participate in the interview anymore. But in terms of the actual analyses, we try to remove the likelihood that these associations are due to other chronic conditions like you mentioned by adjusting for them. So all 61 of these predictors at the very first wave of the study were accounted for.
My last question is, have you thought about doing a qualitative study with these older adults? You mentioned that you include people at the volunteer organization, but have you thought about just talking with the older adults?
That's a fantastic idea. So I don't collect this data. I guess when I said we, I don't know why I said we. I'm like acting like I'm the Health and Retirement Study. The Health and Retirement Study collected this data, and so I'm not interacting with the older adults themselves. But I certainly think that would be really valuable, particularly finding out like what do you feel are the engagements or the things that are preventing you from engaging in informal helping, and like what do you feel are reasons that you might be more likely to or less likely to, and we could certainly learn a lot from that. I think one of the challenges I noticed from talking with United Way is that the older adults that we most need to reach are the hardest to reach. They might live in really rural areas, they might live in long-term care facilities, and so I think one of the challenges will be for the people who most need the people we most need to learn from, like how do we seek them out, find them, interview them in a way that's comfortable. But I was at a talk on qualitative interviewing the other day, and I had a similar thought. I would love to talk to some of these older adults themselves. That's a really great idea. Yes.
Okay, cool. Thanks for the presentation, Julia. I have a more directly data question, then a more personal question. Okay, my data question is, increasingly, like, there are these things that we think are good, but when you add contextual factors to it, it complicates it. So, like, mindfulness is a big thing. People are like, it's the hot new thing, but often it can make people more selfish and, like, focus away their negative emotions. And then, so I think about this thing like informal helping, like, what if I'm just a horrible person and, like, I'm old and now I'm being told, like, hey, you're kind of dispositionally, like, not a great person, but perhaps, like, you'll live longer if you now, like, go help your friends. And so I'm just wondering, like, what are the ethical implications of, like, this is a good thing to do versus how it meets me individually in my life as a person, and, like, we don't fully know the contextual factors around all the findings. So, like, yeah, what is that threshold for, like, this is a recommendation to be made to the general public versus this is more complicated, we need more research?
Yes, great. So certainly, yeah, that's a really interesting viewpoint. And there are people who likely, volunteer for self-oriented reasons. And in that study I mentioned, people who volunteered, like, I'm going to enhance my career, like, I'm going to make myself look like a good person. They didn't actually experience these benefits. Our general thought is that people who volunteer, even if they might start out for these reasons, I'm just here for this mark on my resume, I'm just helping my neighbor to, I don't know, seem like a good person, their motivations aren't necessarily static. And sometimes when you engage in an activity, your motivations can change over time. So maybe you get to know the person you're volunteering with and you think, wow, this is starting to become a really meaningful sort of social interaction. Or maybe, something else. So that's one thing. And then I also think that another thing that's sort of been looked at in the literature, though I don't know too much on this, is that when you're thinking about volunteering in these different things in social groups, over time, if you're someone who's really selfish and you're, like, taking from the community and you start to sort of lose those connections and these opportunities become less available over time, right? So if you're engaging in informal helping, but you're kind of mean to the people around you, you're less likely to have those sorts of opportunities.
Right.
And so those are some things that I'm thinking about, but it's a good question.
Yeah, that's interesting. Okay. And then I guess my last question is, so, like, aging has this existential terror here in the West, right? Like, we're fighting our wrinkles, we're fighting our decrepit bodies. And in some ways, you stare at the face of death by doing your research because you're just thinking about aging all the time. Mm-hmm. So then how does that personally inform your approach to aging? Like, how do you think about you aging as you're studying aging?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I have a controversial view on aging that people don't necessarily agree with. I've had some really sort of exceptional older adults in my life who have made me think of aging as a really positive experience. My grandpa, not the grandpa that I mentioned in this talk, but the other one, lived to the age of 102, extremely active and productive. He was, like, driving at 95, just lived a really, like, amazing life, and did so many things for so many people, and had such a positive attitude about life. And he had a difficult life. He was interned in the Japanese internment camps during World War II, and just always had the most positive outlook about things and how his circumstances were okay. I think aging can be a really positive thing. It's sort of being reframed as this third age of life. Age, I guess, 65 onward, you might still have a third of your life left. And it's a time where you might not have as many responsibilities with caregiving or caring for children. And it's a time to maybe start something new or to volunteer or whatever it may be. And so I think, the view of aging certainly is negative. And ageism is so prevalent. The United Nations published a report and they said, like, 1 in 2 people are extremely ageist and view aging as a bad thing. But I don't think it has to be. I think I've seen many personal examples too that have made me feel that it can be a positive thing.
Thank you.
Thanks, Irene.
Okay, I'm going to ask my question, and then actually we have an online question from Azhar Tayabji,
Amazing.
all the way from India. Yeah, nice. So I'll just ask mine quickly, and it's actually really kind of related to the last one. But I was really thinking about that sort of motivation kind of aspect that's somehow really sticking with me, is this idea that, like, there's this, like, looping effect somehow, is like if you do the thing, if you volunteer for, like, the wrong reasons, then you won't get the positive effects. And so I guess I'm wondering, is there a potential for, you're doing this study, I guess, because like Canada wants to know, like, can we make some recommendations, like, and say scientifically it's good for you and good for your family and good for society if you go out and volunteer. Like, then if everybody, like, we get like the CBC report that says, Julia Nakamura published this paper, and it's going to be like, if you volunteer, then you're going to have all these positive benefits. Like, is there going to be like some kind of looping effect there? And so, yeah, I'm wondering, and then like the sort of follow-up is like, if that's the case, like, do we need science to tell us that like helping other people is a good thing, I guess? And is there other justifications we could make that come from other, cultural sources, like ethical reasons, religious reasons, moral so those are like my two questions.
Okay, there's a lot to unpack there. So if I miss something, let me know. I'm going to start with this sort of first question of this motivation. And I did want to just state that the one study that I mentioned, that was one study, and it wasn't like a worldwide study done in, I think, a US sample that looked at sort of motivation to volunteer. And so that's what they found, that the motivation does matter, but I don't think that's a fully conclusive finding. So just one thing to sort of think about. So the first question was about how motivation might, like, if you see that volunteering is good for you, you then might engage in it. And then, I think, again, it's not necessarily a bad thing if people volunteer and their motivations aren't initially like, I want to help others. They might initially think like, I'm going to volunteer to get to know people. Like, I'm going to volunteer to make friends. And I don't think that's necessarily bad. I think too, again, motivations can change over time. But I don't know that I know too many people who volunteer for only self-oriented reasons. And in that one study, they did find, I think, that people who volunteered both for like career, but they did also report other reasons. Like, I'm also interested in helping the community. It was just they were sort of more self-oriented, but that can shift over time. And then, can you remind me of the second question?
I mean, maybe it's not a very good question, but it's sort of, I guess, like, do we need science to tell us that helping people voluntarily is a good thing to do? Right.
I would argue for society, probably not. I would say it's always good for your neighbor if you can do a favor for them or do something helpful. But I think we're just entering this field of looking at how it affects the helper, like the person doing the helping. So a lot of prior work on aging is focused on risk factors, things like depression, stress, like how do we deal with these sort of things that are making aging worse. But there's been this sort of recent shift in our field to look at, what things can we do to actually promote positive outcomes, again, for the person who's engaging in the helping. And so I think that's why this is of interest. But certainly, volunteering is great for society. It's good for the economy. Volunteers contribute like billions of dollars to the economy annually.
Cool, thank you.
Thanks.
Super interesting. So I'll just read Azer's question real quick since it came in, and then you wanted to ask a question, right? Oh, okay. Well, then that makes it easy. Okay, so Azer asked two questions. First, are these correlations and conclusions North America specific? And then the second is, did COVID-19 confound the study's data collection or indeed enrich it?
Great. Okay, so first question. These findings here specifically are US specific. So this sample is, the Health and Retirement Study is a US based sample. What we're doing next is actually some exciting work in collaboration with Harvard and Baylor. They've started up this Global Flourishing Study, which is supposed to incorporate data from, I believe, 22 countries around the world, and it's got questions on religion and health and psychological well-being. And so we're hoping to ask some of these same questions in these worldwide samples, because again, I do think that these things might operate differently in Eastern and collectivist societies, where maybe informal helping with relatives is more expected than it is in more individualistic societies. And then the second question about COVID, Certainly, we'll have to see what happens with the health and retirement study data over these next few years. But this study was done pre-COVID, so the last wave of data collection here is 2016. And so COVID would not have had an impact here. I am curious to see how volunteering sort of shifts. There's lots of virtual engagement happening, and how that is going to sort of change the volunteering sphere.
Hello.
Hello.
Exquisite talk, Julia. I really enjoyed it. I will certainly begin informally helping people in my community.
Excellent.
Okay, my question is, you've had your head in this literature. You've obviously spent a lot of time reading about what predicts well-being in aging populations. And so I want to know, aside from informal helping, what can I do to live longer?
Yeah, great question. There's a lot of literature focused on helping people age well and live longer. It's of prime interest to people, as was mentioned, that are like afraid of dying and don't want to have like unhealthy, like bad health in later life. There's so many things, and so I think it ends up being a constellation. As I mentioned, in our lab, we're really interested in the positive side of things, so psychological well-being factors, things like people who have higher purpose in life tend to live longer, people who are more satisfied with their lives, and things like that. And we're also spend some time looking at social well-being, so these prosocial behaviors. But I think, it's surprising when some of these psychological factors, like having a strong sense of purpose, actually show effect sizes similar to things like exercise when predicting mortality risk. And so it just goes to show that there's a number of ways to achieve health in later life, and some of those are through just improving sort of your psychological well-being and also views on aging. We recently published some work showing that people who had more positive perceptions of aging were also more likely to live longer. And that could be through a variety of pathways. Like if I view aging more positively, I might engage in healthier behaviors because I'm trying to promote my health. It also, is something where if you think aging is destined to be awful, it might become like a self-fulfilling prophecy where you don't take care of yourself and you don't do the things necessary to age well. So a lot of things you can do to live longer.
Green is good? Yeah. Oh, I thought it was red. Okay. Hi. I was just thinking, and this might not even be a question, it might just be a discussion, but I guess if the goal of your study might be to kind of encourage people to partake in informal helping, and then we talked about like the circularity of like, well, if it benefits me and I do it, then it doesn't actually benefit me, possibly, then maybe it would be actually more beneficial if we looked at the benefits to the one who was helped, and then the people who end up being more inclined to help are actually doing it for the benefit of others. And then they would have their motivation would be to benefit someone else, and then they would actually be benefited.
Right. I really like that idea. I think United Way is doing some work trying to answer that exact question. They were trying to help people, again, retain volunteers, and they were thinking of ways to do this. And one way was to show them the impact that they were having, to say, this, meal delivery package that you're putting together, this is the person it's going to, and this is how they felt when they received it. And so I think, showing people the impact of what they're doing, and like you said, maybe the benefits to the helper, to the helpee, the person who's getting the help. I think that would be a really excellent way to encourage people to do that. So that was, on the formal volunteering side of things, but with informal helping, it also could occur naturally if we can get people to do it. And again, we could show them those benefits. But like this example with my neighbor, you can just see the joy that someone experiences, or they might do something in return. There's a lot of sort of reciprocity with these informal helping actions. So,
and then another discussion, non-question thing. I was just thinking about the hedonistic approach to helping others, and can you even really do anything that's for any other reason than being selfish and self-beneficial? So I'd be really interested,
in the motivation aspect to see how religion plays a part, because I don't know, I think different people have different relationships to their religion. And so maybe sometimes I'm wondering if the reason you're doing something is for the purposes of some godly spirit being happy with you, is that still going to be like a hedonistic reason? You know, like, is it for the benefit of this other thing, or is it actually to benefit you? And then I would wonder, if that were the reason, would you still gain the benefits, or would it have that same looping effect that we were talking about?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think someone was wondering if religious service attendance would predict informal helping, and it didn't in this study, but it did predict formal volunteering when we looked at predictors of volunteering. People who attended religious services were, I forget the exact number, but much more likely to engage in formal volunteering. And so certainly, like, that is a potential pathway through which we increase volunteering. I don't have answers to those questions, but I think that's a really interesting idea. And
were they healthier, the people who volunteered in their religious organizations?
Yeah, so we didn't look at volunteering in health, like, particularly in religious organizations. We did look at, people who, like, attend religious services more, were more likely to volunteer. But we have been thinking about how churches and religious organizations are also a nice framework to think about, like, how volunteering is structured. They have it down to a science, like the way that they encourage volunteering, and the way that we might sort of translate that even to non-religious people as well. The ways that they, like, encourage people to volunteer and, like, maintain, activities through which people can do so. That's a really interesting question.
That would be cool.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. Before you go, Kayla, are we okay on time?
Yeah, it is now 3, so maybe we'll make this the last one.
Last question. Okay. Good.
Okay, so we've been talking about, like, the word health
Mm-hmm.
throughout the presentation, and I just found it interesting. So you were contrasting sort of the individualistic societies versus collective societies,
Mm-hmm.
and the study that it would be in an ideal world we're all helping each other. That's sort of the goal of your research. However, you're conducting research that is trying to prove the individual benefit of conducting acts of service towards others. So that would be deemed more individualistic, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm wondering, isn't there a paradox in that? And then secondly, do you think that this research reinforces the idea of healthism? So the understanding of health, which I'll be talking about it before, but understanding of health, that the primary indicator of health, that you can attain optimal health and well-being through the modification of individual lifestyle behaviors, such as increased physical activity or going to help your neighbor out. And then it sort of takes away from this broad understanding of health, where we understand that there's, like, these systemic forces in place that determine one health. So when you talk about, for example, people who have more of a purpose in life have, like, are aged better. But what about if you've experienced racism your whole life, or anti-fatness, or you've been poor and you've had to deal with chronic stress? Can we really be doing research on studying if somebody has, like, a purpose in life, and if you take into account those race, socioeconomic factors, wouldn't we clearly determine that people with privilege can find a purpose in life?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great questions. So to answer the first, I will say that these informal helping behaviors, I don't know the motivation from person to person, but they're usually done just truly out of a desire to help someone else, from my understanding. And they're actually just done so commonly, they're actually really underreported. They find that when they ask people to, like, do daily diary studies, so write them down every day, they actually end up reporting much more informal helping than when they're asked, like, over the past year, how much of this have you done? Because people, they forget, like, they just do something for their neighbor, or, they don't think of it as, like, I'm going to go do this thing to better my health. It's just kind of something that naturally happens in relationships. And then with your second question in regards to these broader social determinants of health, certainly these are really important. And that's why we're interested in looking at some of these moderators. So, do these associations hold for people of low socioeconomic status or people of certain races and ethnicities, to understand who is experiencing the benefits here, because probably not everyone is equally. And we do need to, look at all of these factors when assessing things like purpose in life. We do see that with purpose in life, we can adjust for things like socioeconomic status and race. We do still see these associations with purpose and health, but certainly, there are larger sort of structural factors that we need to consider when designing interventions and thinking about how to increase purpose for people who might face some of these barriers that you described. Yay. Thanks for coming.